Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It is nice to see you guys here again today if you're on the channel. And honestly, today, or what marks this video, is honestly such a special occasion because I have my brother up here, Lane, and today we're going to be talking about a very touchy subject within Islamic discussion. This is basically a fiqh issue, basically among scholars and interpretation and application to Islamic tradition, right? So, you may be asking, what is this topic of discussion which is so sacred that even scholars are talking about it across from different schools like Hanabali, or there's Shalafi, there's Maliki scholars as well. Well, this type of topic often brings up in the subject of zina. Zina is the major sin of course, committing adultery are things outside the law of marriage. There's zina of the heart, there's zina of the ears, zina of the eyes. There's also zina of the mind. There's a lot of types of zina which we try and get away from. Truly, my brothers and sisters, it's something not to really play around with because even angels, you know, are truly shy to even write it down, my brothers and sisters. So, when I bring up this topic, what is it specifically regarding zina? Well, of course, it's masturbation. Masturbation is always debated upon. And I think it just serves us right to make some type of discussion about it or video in which is informing everybody about this or even a way to look at it right. So, what is going on? Like, what is the discussion about specifically also about masturbation? Is it makruh or is it haram? Today, I will be covering the makruh side, and my brother Lane will also be covering the haram side. And we see if it's permissible or just encouraged, or impermissible, of course. Not permissible, but not encouraged or is impermissible. So, we might as well start off with saying what is some of the argumentations or what is some of the things which support the makruh side specifically. So we also are going to be going off arguments by Maliki scholars and seeing what type of evidence or thing which they propose. So one I can say, for example, what is like a identify thing which these strict scholars go upon? Like the Shalafi is a definitive type of thing which of course they're very strict in their terminology and Quranic interpretation. When I say Quranic interpretation, yes, there is Quran verses. This comes from a surah, Manumon, I think. I'm not sure. I'm not sorry if I pronounced that wrong or butchered it. Please don't butcher me for butchering that. This verse comes from Quran 23, 5 through 7. This talks about guarding your chastity from those who are not your spouse, right? And then anyone who seeks beyond that is clearly going to be a transgressor against that, and obviously sinner, right? So what type of thing or type of zina this does this cover? Like going off the makruh interpretation for this Quranic verse, we can certainly say that this could also mean through marriage relationships, where it says if we seek a partner beyond that, then we are literally going against our wives or the sacred promise of nikah. What is nikah? It's the promise of a marriage, right? Once you have your spouse, so stay up. You can have four wives, but that's if you're going to treat them equally, love them equally, and etc. If not, it's probably best you do that to avoid. You don't do that to avoid zina with your one wife, because again, the love will be unbalanced, and that's just cheating on your other wife, right? So it's very hard to maintain that. But when you go off this Quranic interpretation, let's specifically get up the Quranic verse and show what it is specifically so we can talk about it inherently, right? And we could base it off, what talks about this, and we could see if the guys is pretty, decent to talk about within makruh circumstances, right? So as you can see, this is Surah Al-Mu'minun, right? So it says, except with their wives or those bondwomen in their possession, for when then they are free from blame. But whoever seeks beyond this are transgressors, right? So clearly, we see from the perspective more so about the correct interpretation, right? So let's cover Maliki scholar argumentation because I've said we're gonna cover that, and obviously I'm not gonna backtrack on my word. That's pretty stupid of me. But once we get into the Maliki and Shalafi scholars, what they say is that this could be an act of sexual things or zina of the mind and intention to go and do that, and also then cheat on your spouse. That's adultery, zina. Once I've already covered these types of categories, like one leads to another, right? So one, you're committing zina of the mind, right? When you consider zina of the mind, it's your mind, of course, telling you to go ahead and do this. It's your thought, right? Masturbation inherently doesn't have to be sexual, right? Masturbation inherently can be addictive, and it could lead to several like disorders or something like that. It could lead to physical problems, which is the reason why people also argue that masturbation should be prohibited because it harms the body given to you by the creator. There's also the fact that we assume it's sexual in the first place. Yes, it can also lead to sexual things, and of course semen being impure. And when I say it's sexual, it inherently means that it's going to lead to something sexual as well. Like as I said, there's the mind going towards this specific thing, like adultery. A lot of scholars argue because this also like breaks the bonds of the thing, and we already went to like again the transgressors outside of that, right? And if you're of course whacking your stuff, even though you already have a spouse, to unguard your chastity with, you're unguarding your chastity, which again contradicts the point of going to guard your chastity. But the point is that it's guarding your chastity by yourself, except with your wife. But when you say, oh yeah, well, anything beyond this, right? That's when I brought up, of course, speaking wise, the relational relationships. What a relationship is, I already went over it. It's the promise of nikah or marriage, right? If you're within marriage, right, this could just mean this, right? And of course, if it's just going towards adultery, I don't think it is, unless because this is like more so your your chastity, right? Guard your chastity within, unless it's with your wife. This is of course going into your relationship with your wife, specifically your relationship. We're talking about the two entities within the set in which we discuss over this action, right? But if we include one outside the relationship, does this inherently mean that you're a transgressor if you're going out of that relationship? If it's only tied to this relationship, it doesn't inherently have to be, because masturbation is self-pleasure. Masturbation is self-pleasure and doesn't have to mean you commit because of another thing you see, in which by, of course, Islamic, not Islamic, so, mind of the zina, right? Because you're self-pleasuring yourself in that sense. Pleasuring yourself is not breaking that. It's only going towards yourself, right? So if you go off the interpretation in that sense and assume it's sexual, though, then yes, you could be committing zina of the mind, right? But the point is that it's not inherently zina of the mind if it's just for self-pleasure in itself, which doesn't fulfill sexual acts, because you need the sexual motive. If you lack the sexual motive, like say for example, masturbation could be used for inherently like releasing stress. That's like scientifically proven or statistically shown to relieve stress. It could be a method and it could be medically prescribed. And Hanbali scholars argue to avoid, of course, zina if it gets to that point where you have to do this. It's better than committing zina because zina is the sin. If it's what you must do, if it's physically unattainable to get a wife, to avoid breaking this, sacred contract or doing something with zina on the mind, of course, if it's physically needed to suit yourself, again, suffer and commit a sin, it's better to do that. Hanbali scholars do argue this, right? And Hanbali scholars say it's generally not the case that it's permitted, but of course, in that sense, right? But if we go on the interpretation, which is, more so talk about not sexual relations, but, marriage promising, then of course, if you're not inherently committing zina of the eye, or zina of the heart, of course, and zina of the mind, which is, of course, inherently going doing something sexual, doing that, you're relieving stress, or doing this to avoid zina, your intention in that way, then you can inherently say it's makruh, because again, sitting there saying, oh yeah, it could lead to adultery or sexual thing is possible. It's not like it's not. Because inherently, if you have that motive and you're ready to masturbate, sexually speaking, then obviously you can break that sexual, not the sexual, but you can inherently cause that, or you can be a transgressor. But the point is again, is going against the interpretation of Quranically speaking. So if we go over to the more so Quranic interpretation, which is like saying you're a transgressor if you seek anything beyond, having your wife, unguard your chastity. There's also dry humping, I guess. Guarding your chastity inherently could mean keeping it away and not talking it, or it could be meaning clothing, right? Guarding your chastity, from the public is inherently also Islamically encouraged because it covers yourself, it covers your body parts, which are only provided for your wife to see. Again, relationships again with your wife. But again, if you are not doing this, then obviously it could refer to clothing. But I mean, again, this is again with you and your wife, right? In that sense, except with your bond wife, your bond woman. If again contradicts that point, speaking wise, and sexually is encouraged instead of also like the clothing wise, because it talks about, oh yeah, unless it's with your bondwoman. Also still points to this, but of course, if you don't have a wife, and it's still encouraged you to keep your just woman and to lower your gaze as well to avoid zina of the eye, right? The zina of the eye part is more so inherently talking about looking at this stuff and trying to avoid it, because again, when you consider makruh analytically speaking, or by definition, true by definition, analytics often point to makruh being disencouraged and etc. Right? But if you're inherently masturbating without the zina of the eye, right, it's not exactly pure, but it's also purer. It says within the Quran, it's like more purer to, of course, lead to more so, like in the sense that to not do this stuff. But inherently, if you do this as again like as a last effort to avoid that zina clause or look at that and unguard your chastity, then do that to avoid it. It's like hambali. So let's get into some of the other arguments which inherently talk about makruh or which is like against masturbation. Like inherently, we're going to be talking about Ayman Ahmed Hanbali. We're going to be talking Maliki scholar arguments. So, like, say for example, people argue because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has suggested otherwise, like to fast instead of masturbate. He would have suggested this. That often comes up within Maliki scholar argumentations. But the problem with this is that it's only a contingent true proposition. Like, say for example, within time, times have changed and it's more hard to control yourself. With phones constantly being a thing and inherently just a lot of gooner Muslim boys, right? Attempting to avoid it can be hard because of addiction, right? And it's harming your body. As a last ditch effort to avoid it, obviously to avoid these things like masturbation must be key because it's physically needed to stop from zina, like physically needed, as I brought before, right? The Prophet Muhammad, Islam, or peace be upon him if I butchered that, has completely said that fasting is more valid, but this comes at a time where social media was not present. Time has changed and it proves the proposition is contingent in that way. I'm not saying the Prophet is wrong. I'm accepting it's a true contingent proposition, that it's valid advice and etc. But in the more sense, to control yourself, it could be needed, and it's not necessarily a necessary type of advice because times do change, and to fit criteria, socially speaking, you're going to have to need this. So I mean, it's pretty dumb to assume because it's only an appeal to possibility when you sit there and say it's going to potentially work. It's an appeal to possibility, and especially with times changing, it only makes it less more likely. And through the likelihood of the possibility to even be the case that it's going to work because the time's changing. If anything, you could just refute this by saying it's a contingent proposition, not necessarily necessary across all things, which must be the case. Secondly, scholars also argue that divine authority tells us to keep themselves chaste. What does chaste mean? But of course, protected. When it comes to masturbation, though, what if someone is more so, self-stimulated. Like, what is the like thing? Like, yes, you could sit there and say it's breaking the contract to tell us, oh yeah, but that's only waiting for moderation when it comes to women and etc. You could sit there and say this interpretation could be open to not committing sex outside of marriage, that type of zina, and following the mind of zina and etc. Right? Your battle against zina could apply to this, right? There's a lot of different interpretations, and when you sit there and say it tells us to practice patience and control, this could be for against, of course, like other people within a system who want to try and commit zina. It's not necessarily trying to tell us to get away from masturbation, but it is inherently good for also practicing against masturbation. Scholars also argue that against the thing that masturbation can cause physical harm. I thought I brought up, but masturbation can also relieve stress, therefore mentally also helping your body and your mind focus more and etc. There's also like clarity after that, so the stress is gone. There's a lot of clarity to focus and etc. So I mean, also doesn't just help stress, but also boosts like mental fortitude. So if anything, it's better to keep balance. Don't do it always, but do it when like stress. I'm not sitting there saying do masturbation. I'm sitting there saying this is a way to probably counter the argument, saying, oh yeah, well, what if it's more appropriate to be balanced because of what we know about masturbation and our epistemology of the topic, not necessarily saying, oh yeah, go ahead and do that. Another thing also is that a lot of scholars say it's also kind of degrading yourself and your humility, your honor, and etc. I'd sit there and say that letting yourself mentally suffer also deteriorates your mind and can lose a lot of focus, especially when it comes to putting your time or acknowledgement on the creator. If anything, letting yourself suffer, and then if you have this option, I mean, that's also kind of degrading your own man somewhat, and a lot of things can also there. And a lot of people sit there and say, "Oh yeah, well, go ahead, trust his timing." Yes, we get that, but you also need mental fortification and focus to do this. So, if anything, a lot of the arguments we covered, which were by scholars, have been countered for the makruh side. I've covered it, but I'm not inherently agreeing with makruh, but I am supporting a side where it's inherently studied upon, right? Um, so, assalamu alaikum, Lane. Now you can finally take your stage and give your beautiful kalam. I'm happy to have you here, my brother. Honestly, I am.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, this right here, very happy to participate with Siba, right? But currently, this is going to be the core foundation of my part. So, I was discussing about the principles of masturbation and between the concepts of whether it was makruh or haram. Now, just to give more basis upon the topic, this is a fiqh issue, right? Fiqh issue is Islamic jurisprudence or basically law in Islam, school of law, right? It's actually not a modern opinion debate. So, here are some key things that we need to get before we go over masturbation, and that is what did each madhab teach it, or what did it reach between it, and what usul. Usul, if you don't know what that is, it's a principle in Islam that basically means legal principles. So what usul is behind the concept of masturbation within Islam, right? First, we also need to know the ruling. So, for that, the core principle of where this topic came from, whether it was makruh or haram, right? I personally believe, since I chose the Maliki Shafi foundation and I come from Shafi roots, right? The core Quranic principle that is used by the majority, or basically made an ijma, if I'm not mistaken for it being an ijma, right? Basically, the three madhabs we're going to be focusing on is Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi, right? So the verse here says, quote, I'm going to say it in English, of course, because that's easier for the main audience, right? It says, and those who guide their private parts, except from their spouses, or those their right hands possess. Whoever seeks beyond that, then they are transgressors. This is Surah Al-Muminun 23, chapter, verses 5 to 7, right? Now, the key legal question becomes, is masturbation seeking beyond that? Now, if yes, then it's prohibited. If no, then that means it's potentially allowed in cases, right? Now, the three madhabs. Shafi madhab, the ruling is completely haram because the Shafi is probably, or actually is the most strict madhab in Islam. Because the dominant Shafi position is that masturbation is prohibited. The reasoning for that is because They interpret the verse as sexual fulfillment is restricted to two things, or could be more, but mainly two things. The core is two things, right? Marriage and ownership. Ownership, this point has a historical category, if that makes sense. So anything outside of that is farirun, which is basically transgression out of it, right? Now, masturbation in here is viewed as a sexual act outside of lawful channels, right? Therefore, included in seeking beyond. So the usul principle used is I believe, humanitarian principle, which basically says the default ruling regarding sexual matters is prohibited. Meaning, unlike things like food or clothing, which are halal by default, sexual gratification is restricted unless explicitly allowed, since of course no clear permission exists, therefore it remains prohibited. Let's go to the Maliki madhab, right? The ruling is haram, mainly because the Malikis are even stricter in tone. They consider it a violation of modesty. They consider it a misuse of sexual faculty outside divine structure. Now, some Maliki jurists classified it as a form of minor transgression against the body entrusted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, some usul principles that are used are ones from the Maqasid and ones from, I think, the classical form of usul in the classical books, which is blocking the means. This first principle basically says anything that opens the door to zina is restricted. There's one verse in the Quran that says, unquote, do not even go near zina. It's not even do not touch zina, do not get in the domain of zina. No, do not even get near zina, right? Do not even get near zina because zina is highly destructive, right? One example I'll use is that if you ever commit zina, angels, when they write down, or the angels that write down your sins, they will be shy to write it down. That's how dangerous and destructive zina is. And therefore, here, masturbation is seen as a gateway to fantasizing, right? Which may lead to zina, because masturbation, right, can be a form of zina. There's multiple types of zinas. For example, if you didn't know this, e-sex, the concept of e-sex, right, is actually zina. It's zina of the eyes, it's zina of the heart, it's zina of the mind, right? Because you are basically role playing and entrusting that you are having sexual intercourse when you really aren't. But it's still zina of the eyes, you know? And masturbation, while it isn't inherently zina, it can be considered a way of it, which is zina of the brain, zina of the mind, zina of fantasizing, right? Now, here's what I was talking about the Maqasid version, right? Which is kind of gradual, or actually has self-preservation. There's preservation of lineage, morality, and dignity. So sexuality in here is regulated to protect society. So self-release outside of lawful intimacy contradicts this structure, right? Now going on the Hanbali madhab, right? This one is kind of more nuanced and layered and pretty complex, right? So I might as well just say it shortly but understandable, if that makes sense. All right? Now, before we of course do that, can AI do it? Can a robot explain masturbation under the Hanbali madhab? Can a robot explain all the important principles regarding masturbation? Can you? Well, yes, I can. The official position in the Hanbali madhab is haram, but there's of course a famous secondary position, allowing it in necessity. So some Hanbali scholars held if a person fears zina and has no access to marriage, then masturbation becomes permissible as a lesser harm. The legal principle used is committing the lesser of two harms. So if the only alternatives are zina, which is a major sin, and masturbation, then masturbation is tolerated. So there's multiple situations. The what is that? The normal circumstances would be haram. But the fear of zina, which is another circumstance, obviously the only circumstance where it's actually permissible, that's a Hanbali ruling. Now based on makruh versus haram, both these madhab, Shafi, Maliki, and Hanbali, they view this as haram. There's really no makruh. I don't even think that the Hanafi madhab views it as makruh, right? Because the idea of makruh mainly appears in Hanbali necessity discussions, and in some minority later opinions, right? There's another cough. There we go. Sorry for you, right? But the dominant classical position is it's haram. Now the key foundational principles here are going to be at least how many? Like maybe 7 principles. Who knows? But the sexuality is structured. It's not free. Islam doesn't treat sexual release like hunger or thirst. So food is default and sex is default. But of course, it's defaultly restricted. Why? Because it affects lineage, it affects family structure, it affects society, and it affects spiritual discipline, right? The body is an amana. Now, an amana in Islam is basically trust, right? Your desires exist, but their fulfillment, of course, has boundaries, right? We have moral boundaries, we have physical boundaries as well. Islam, it doesn't deny desire, it regulates it, obviously. So even if something is zina, if it leads towards zina psychologically or habitually, that's how you say it, right? It may be restricted. Because the lesser harm is an exception. That's why Hanbalis allow it in some cases. Preventing a major sin can temporarily permit a lesser one. Or, there's also spiritual dimensions where classical scholars often link self-restraint, fasting, marriage to develop patience, discipline, and taqwa. That's why the Prophet ﷺ recommended fasting for those unable to marry. Right? And here's the important balance. Even when prohibited, Islam recognizes struggle. Right? Which is a classical discussion that was legal. It's not really a shame about culture. Right? They didn't say you're evil or these people are evil. They really said control is ideal, of course. Marriage is the solution to control, and fasting is the tool. So there's the entire explanation for the Hanbali madhab. Hope you're happy.